Hey, welcome back. Hope you guys had a good week. Mine was pretty good. Still hotter than the devil's donuts here in Oklahoma. Got that hot freshness on that haircut. Barber barely cut me again this week on my neck. Got our stuff ready to start installing on this LS engine. Before we jump in and start changing the cam in our block, we need to get our heads ready to cover it up when we're finished. So the first thing we'll do is our trunnion upgrade, and then we'll worry about the valve springs and the heads. How bad of a day is it when this happens in your engine? So he showed you some of this in the last video, how this is kind of just a thin stamped steel bearing housing that goes on these factory LS rocker arms, and you can see the needle bearings inside there, which that's kind of on purpose, and we'll show you that in a second. There's just almost no way to do it without one of these tools, or well, I guess you could, but not without a press. But this makes it nice and easy. Remember we talked about the magnet too, that kind of holds it in place. Well, for the most part, these must be heavy-duty factory rockers. Then we're going to take this little guy, which sits right in that dimple in the factory bearing, and everything should line up automatically for you. It's going to kind of explode once it finally lets go, and it'll come into pieces. There we go. What we've done is we've forced the factory trunnion all the way through. You'll notice they're open on one end, and then again just stamped steel on this side. Now these are our upgraded trunnions, and it's important to put the side that says USA facing out, because the way this bearing is designed, the side is completely it completely encapsulates the roller bearings or the needle bearings on the outside edge, whereas it's not quite as tall on the inside edge. And the idea is the oiling groove, which is here, it allows more room for oil to get into these needle bearings. If you put it this way, it would basically have too tall of a sidewall and wouldn't let oil in on those bearings. So we get set up again. What we're going to do is press the bearing into one side first. We can just drop it in around our tool. It's made perfectly for that. Also, this holder should keep everything square, so you don't have to worry about trying to feed it in there at a bad angle. So now that that side's done, I'm going to drop this trunnion in here, and it really doesn't matter which direction it goes, just inside. And the trunnions themselves came with these big flat washers, which what it'll do is it'll keep the bearing in this side as we're pressing in the bearing on this side instead of letting the trunnion push it out. So get that started, tighten this up. It's kind of nice, and we did have that magnet holding this in place. We install this bearing, it's flush. Now the last step is to put those snap rings to keep anything from walking out. The important part of this step is get some decent snap ring pliers, because you could spend all day fighting a bad tool. That's a trunnion upgrade. 15 more. Here's a pro tip. Do work like replacing the valve springs in your heads indoors where the weather's always good, unless your woman won't let you. My woman's at work, so she has no idea. It's funny, when I got out my LS valve spring compressor tool, UPS delivery shows July of 2010. Would you guys comment below? Tell me, what were you doing in July of 2010? Because I know I was rebuilding a LS6 in a Z06 Corvette, because that's what I bought this for. Here's kind of a little extra step you should do. Once you take your valves out of your heads, you can turn them upside down. Now you can see how clean these valve sealing surfaces look. All I literally have done is rub that with this microfiber towel. You can see how there's like a little darkness here. I'm not sure if the camera picks it up very well, but just rubbing it with this towel and maybe apply just a little bit of elbow grease cleans these surfaces up really nice. Here's a trick I use to clean up the valves pretty easy. Carefully just chuck these up into your drill motor. Remember to just stay at the top here where only the keeper clips are going to be in there. They're not going to be traveling through a valve guide or anything, so just even slight teeth marks aren't going to hurt these. I think a gray Scotch-Brite pad, which is a little less aggressive than red. I'm going to put this into a box because I'm in the house and I don't want to make a mess. Just turn it slow. Hold that pad on that surface. And then maybe on the bottom. You can look at the difference between this valve now and one that we haven't done. This kit from Summit, which states it comes with brown canister style valve seals, shipped with these blue valve seals, which don't fit our rectangular port head valve stem guides. I called them or got on their text app thing, which works pretty awesome to be honest with you, and let them know. So they gladly shipped me out 16 more of these blue valve seals. I got back on the texting app and just basically gave them this part number, and so they upgraded it to next day, and now we have brown valve seals. Thought maybe you guys would want to see this before I had them all done. So we're going to start when we reassemble these heads with a locator, because these steel springs on an aluminum head over time would end up just eating their way into them because of the softer metal. So you need a steel locator. Then these valve seals that we waited so patiently 3 times for. Whoops, we're going to make sure those get pressed down to where they seat really well, which takes a little elbow grease. There it goes. Then we get a valve spring, or in this case, valve springs. Set them in there. Top it with a keeper. And these valve spring compressor tools are mostly junk, unless you maybe, I don't know, I've never used one of the $100+ ones. Maybe it's way better, but these things just are almost a one-time use kind of situation because the metal just wears out. Let's not forget a valve, which this is an exhaust valve. Put that in there. There we go. Now when we see the grooves that these locks drop in, they're tapered. They're pretty obvious to see which side goes down. Drop those in place inside these retainers. Slide that around. You want to have it tightened up just enough that these retainers can drop in place, not too much, and over tightening it. And you watch them just sit right up in their spot. And that is installing a valve spring. Alright, we're going to get this cam installed, and I have it all cleaned and blown out and everything, because sometimes internally they'll have some goops and chunks. Also, I want to point out that I have cleaned the block surfaces and blown it out internally, as well as cleaned the heads. This is engine assembly lube. It's from Lucas. I had it for years. When you buy one of these, they tend to last a long time. This stuff is thick as molasses, which the idea is for oil to stay on whatever components that you're lubricating with it, so it doesn't drain off over time while you're waiting to fire your engine for the first time. It's also not too terribly thick that it can gum up an oil filter. And you don't want to get aggressive with cam installs, because I have seen where people have knocked a cam bearing loose from hitting it with the cam itself. Cam bolts call for this fastener lube. A lot of people would expect to see these be Loctited more than likely, because general rule of thumb is any fastener that's bolted to something that spins should have some form of thread locker on it to prevent it from backing out. But go with the manufacturer's recommendations. This cam sprocket has this little dip. It's not really a circle, but it is kind of like a, I don't know, like a drip almost mark. And then I've got the Engine at top dead center for number 1, you can tell because the piston's at the top and this circle is pointing straight up. There's all kinds of different theories about maybe what to treat your cylinder walls with, WD-40 or like fogging oil or preservative. But I just like to use the engine oil that I'm going to run and just wipe a thin layer on the cylinder walls before I bolt down those cylinder heads. Drop that one in as a keeper to hold our head in place. So what ARP wants us to do is place these washers with the chamfer side up in the place where they're going to hold the head on, dry and clean. And we lubricate the threads like we did on our cam bolts. And drop them in place. First sequence is 25 foot-pounds, and we're not putting the top bolts in until these have made it to their final torque specs. Now we go to 50. Now we run it up to 80 for our final pass on the big bolts. Now all these 8mm bolts are torqued to 25 from the inside out. Now it's time to put the other head on. It seems to me that the most overthought or overly stressed about part of building an engine is running the valves, and it's honestly just a pretty straightforward procedure that just kind of makes common sense. One of the things I like to do before assembling the valve train is have these push rods in a Ziploc bag, which luckily that's how they come from Brian Tooley. Pour some of our engine oil in there. It's one of those things I've always done, and I probably will always continue to do. Alright, I've got grease or assembly lube on the threads of all these rocker bolts. This is an intake rocker since it has that offset to it. So we're just going to start threading these by hand. So the torque spec on these rocker arm bolts is 22 foot-pounds. But this isn't rocket surgery. There's a million ways to look it up. The main thing is make sure they're both on the base circle, even if it just takes turning the engine over until you can confirm that neither one of them is moving. Like so. Now, we know that one is good. So I'm going to turn it till there's no up and down play. Alright, so that sets at zero valve lash. Now I'm gonna hope that between like 1.5 or 2 turns that this is gonna be reaching the 22 pound-feet. 1. It's about 1 3/8 turn. And that's a way to check to see if you've got the right length push rods, which we do. So we'll do 15 more and the valves will be ran. So kind of a rule of thumb or a way to check your work once you feel like you've ran all of your valves. It's not going to hurt anything to just rotate the engine over until you see them operate one by one. But also give away any binding potentially that you had in your valve train or in your short block for that matter. We've had a bunch of goodies show up, as you might see over there on the cart, including this timing chain dampener or damper. So we can get this installed, and we can do the oil pump, and then the pickup tube, the windage tray, and put the oil pan back on. You want to be mindful of this O-ring on the pickup tube 99% of the time. If you have a low oil pressure issue on an LS, it's because this got pinched or out of place somehow. What the heck? You probably noticed that I painted the engine block, although we had camera malfunctions, so you will not see footage of that. What you will see is us finishing up putting this front cover on. As soon as I get some oil, and we will then put some oil. We picked up an oil filter. We'll put some oil in it before we screw it on, and then we'll go ahead and pour oil into our engine over the rocker arms, down the push rods, and down this lifter valley before we seal everything up. Unfortunately, the powder coater reached out and said he wasn't going to have our covers finished before I needed to get this video uploaded, so it's bagged and ready. I was really hoping to have a super cool payoff and put that high ram on here and it would look awesome, but unfortunately not. But I appreciate you guys sticking around. I hope you found this helpful. If you're ever building an LS engine, some of the things that we went over, or if you're just curious about what some of that stuff means that you've heard people say. Appreciate you watching if you're still with me, and we'll see you next week.